Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm YIVO's Public Programs Director. And we're pleased to have you here with us for the third lecture in this year's Yiddish Civilization Lecture Series. This is a series that's a part of our Yiddish summer program, the Uriel Weinreich Summer Program in Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture. And it is meant as an opportunity to bring some of the breadth and the depth of Yiddish culture both to the students in the program, but also to a broader audience as well. And just for those that don't know about YIVO, YIVO is a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have a library and archive with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which are used by researchers from around the world. And we have a variety of public programs like this and classes like our Yiddish summer program and much more, and exhibitions that bring to life the world of this culture and of this history. And to introduce today's lecture and today's speaker, I'm going to hand it over to David Brown, the academic director of our summer program.
Very brief words from me. I get to greet Professor Barry Trachtenberg, who I overlap with at the Uriel Weinreich Summer Program of YIVO. Again, after a good couple of decades, we first met each other when he was Bezalel Trachtenberg in my intermediate class, I believe it was, at the summer program of 1996, a very memorable year with a very memorable group of people. All years are memorable, and that year especially produced some fantastic scholars who remained in the field of Yiddish, who grew in the field of Yiddish studies and became the book writers and the researchers in the field of Yiddish studies. So it's a real pleasure to be back at the Zuma program with Barry Trachtenberg. Barry is the Rubin Presidential Chair of Jewish History at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. He is the author of The Revolutionary Roots of Modern Yiddish and the United States and the Nazi Holocaust, Race, Refuge, and Remembrance, and a third recently published book, The Holocaust and the Exile of Yiddish, a history of the Algemeyne Entsiklopedye, fascinating book that I saw up close as it was being put together. And Barry's talk right now is entitled Displacement and Creative Resilience in the Modern Jewish Age. Barry, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. It's really my honor to be back to the Zoomer program. And I'd like to thank you, David, for the introduction and having been one of my very first Yiddish teachers back in 1996. Thank you to Alex as well as to Jane for making this talk possible. This is a return in another way. In 2008, when I was just first working on the Algemeyne Entsiklopedye, I had an opportunity to speak to the Zoomer program about the work as it was in its infancy, and now it's really an honor for me to be back to talk about the work now that it's completed. I'd like to apologize for my limitations with Zoom. I'm not very good at reading the chat while talking, but I'm assured that at the end there'll be an opportunity for Q&A and for back and forth. I also have a bibliography that I would like to share with you very quickly, and this is a list of the different sources that I'll be referring to in the talk today. So it's there for you if you want to follow up with anything. I'm also going to disappear and share my screen with you so that you can see the slides that I've prepared for today, and hopefully those are now available for you. So what I would like to talk about today is a phenomenon of Jewish cultural responses to crises and catastrophe. And in many ways, it's a topic that I've been fascinated since my earliest days as a graduate student. And it's perhaps one of the few threads that runs through almost all of my scholarly work. And I would like to use this talk to the Zoomer program in part to you in the audience, but also in particular to the students who are in various stages of learning about Yiddish and Ashkenazic Jewish history and culture, to try to introduce this subject and to explore some of its contours. And as a way to begin, I would like to call attention to Sholem Yankev Abramovich's short story, Shem and Japheth on the Train, Shem Japheth Ba'agalah, which is a story that he wrote in 1890. And this story is one that's not only sort of a classic that's written by, really one of the founders of both modern Hebrew and modern Yiddish literature, but it's also a story that's sort of near and dear to my heart because it was one of the first works of Hebrew literature that I studied as a graduate student with Arnold Band at UCLA. And we spent many, many weeks going over this story sort of line by line as Dr. Band noted for me the many layers to Abramovich's Hebrew writing, the biblical, Mishnaic, Talmudic, rabbinic, and of course the Maskilic levels. And what I realized in the process of working through this story was that Abramovich was literally crafting the language as he was writing, something he would do for Hebrew as well as for Yiddish. And this story in particular sort of represents Abramovich in many ways, really the height of his powers. To quickly summarize the story for those of you who may not be familiar with it, and I really strongly recommend reading it on your own, is that it's set in about 1885 or so, during the time of the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who is perhaps remembered most for being the architect of German unification, which was an act that, among other factors, brought about the civic emancipation of German Jewry, something that German Jews had been hoping for and working towards for nearly a century. But Bismarck also insisted in the year 1885 on expelling Polish Jews and ethnic Poles from his empire, about 30,000 in all. Many of these who had been expelled had lived in Germany for decades, but had not become citizens. And like many of Abramovich's story, it's told through the persona of this figure, Mendele the Bookseller. And Mendele has come to become sort of a stand-in for the author Abramovich himself among many readers and critics. And Mendele is this fascinating character of Abramovich's who tells the stories for us. And it's sort of through his gaze that many of Abramovich's stories are told. And he's considered sort of an old-fashioned figure, kind of bumbles his way through selling religious texts and calendars from community to community, sort of an itinerant figure who's quite observant, but also sort of quite naive in some ways with what he's observing. And at the beginning of this particular story, Shem Japheth on the train, it's set on the railroad. And so the railroad, of course, is something that's really quite new in the Russian Empire in the 1880s. And it is seen throughout much of Yiddish and Hebrew literature as really sort of a hallmark of modernity. It really represents sort of the changing times. But for Mendele, this is not necessarily a sign of progress. For him, as he talks about, you can see even just in this first page of the story here from the Dovodrowski's translation, that he tells this as a site of confinement and constriction, really in contrast to traveling by horse and carriage, which he sees as a luxurious, it's peaceful, it's quiet. But instead, the railroad, it forces people to be governed by timetables, by fixed routes. It represents a site of segregation for Jews who are usually confined to the third-class compartments, as opposed to Gentiles, who he sees are usually in the first and second class. In many ways, it's a site where it's replete with the mechanisms of surveillance and control of ticket inspectors and train conductors and watchmen sort of observing everyone's behavior. And also, during this time of expulsion, the train itself is a site of displacement and forced migration, in which Jews are really forced to succumb to the humiliations and degradations of the modern age. What we also see in this story is that the railroad becomes a place in which Jews have to adopt stratagems for avoiding or contending with the different mechanisms of power and authority of the various oppressive regimes to which they are, beholden. And the story is also set in this interesting time, and really this fascinating time of intensifying nationalism into where one is defined almost strictly according to one's national identification, leading in the case of the story's central character, Reb Moshe, who's Mendele's companion on the train, to the erasure of Jews, since they now have to be foremost members of established national groups, Russian, French, and German. And it leads to this particular exchange, which I find quite fascinating. It's like, so Mendele says, "What's all this? Do you mean that now you're not a Jew?" And Reb Moshe says, "I'm a Jew no longer, for there are no Jews left anymore." The Germans who perform miracles of science have turned the clock back 1,000 generations so that all of us in this day are living in the time of the flood, right? So this is the modern age for Mendele and you know, as he sees it for Jewry. But yet in the middle of this very sort of rich description of Jewish displacement and consequences of being a Jew in the age of progress, this Pole pops up from underneath the seat of Reb Moshe. He's this figure named Pani, and his last name is enormously difficult to pronounce, intentionally so. It's sort of meant as this ironic sort of twist on the difficulty of Polish names. It's I'm going to try to pronounce it. It's Przewodnik, appears from under the seat, right? And Mendele is very confused by this. Of what is this Polish figure doing among all these Jews coming up from under the seats? And Reb Moshe says, it's really fine. He's an old disciple of mine. And he's a disciple in the art of what it means to be a Jew. And it turns out, and so for the rest of this particular story, Mendele recounts, or Reb Moshe recounts for Mendele how this figure, who he just refers to as Pani, meaning Mr., came to be under Reb Moshe's tutelage. And it turns out that this Pole had been an old friend. And as youth, they used to play together. They used to visit one another's homes. And then Pani turned on Reb Moshe during the time period of rising anti-Semitism in Germany, and began, even enacted physical violence against Reb Moshe. And then Reb Moshe is expelled with his family. But then, of course, as it happened, Pani was also expelled from Germany and found himself wandering throughout the world with nowhere to go, but more importantly, no skills and no community to support him in his newly found exile. He realized he just simply could not survive on his own. And Reb Moshe finds him in this degraded condition, having been kicked out of a tavern in which he'd bought a meal that he couldn't pay for. And Reb Moshe instantly forgives him, and he quotes a line from Maimonides that says that exile atones for sin. And he says, what you need to do is you need to become a Jew. And he says, and Pani is sort of horrified by this idea. He said, no, you don't need to convert, but you need to learn the ways of being Jewish in the world. And I'll just show you the quote here. It says, listen, I said to my friend, life in exile, this precious gift from God's store, belongs only to the Jews, his chosen people. It's ours alone, for no other nation or race in the world has the strength to take it and to bear its weight. Stay a Christian as you've always been, and keep your religion in your own way. But there's one thing you must do. You must come to master the Jewish art of living and cleave to that if you're to preserve yourself and carry the yoke of exile. At first, this will be hard for you, excuse me, but in the course of time, you'll learn through suffering, for pain begets endurance, right? And so many scholars have commented on this work, such as Robert Alter, Netta Stahl, Gershon Schockhead. They've focused on various aspects of the story, including calling attention to its ironic gap between language and its object of reference, to the way in which the story is rooted in the Exodus, and how the story illustrates ruptures in time and language that were the hallmarks of the railroad era. But for my interest, and why I'm starting my talk with it today, is what I find so amazing about the story is that it's a warning that the displacements that were prompted by the modern age were going to accelerate and expand, and that this required new strategies of survival, but also new bonds of solidarity. And what we see is that it's the kind of the universalizing of the Jewish experience of exile. And what's different about this age is that now the Jew Shem and the Gentile or Pole Japheth are now in the train together, having to suffer through the displacements and expulsions that become a hallmark of the modern age. And it's the prescience of this that I find really so attractive about the story, because it's really one of the first works that I've encountered that recognized what many later would come to comment, such as Hannah Arendt or Yuri Zelskin, that the condition of the modern age is that of the Jew. And yet, in the very act of writing this story, of adopting this literary form, as well as in the choices of Reb Moshe and his family to adopt their former Polish tormentor and share their secrets of survival, Abramovich also points to us another outcome, that of the necessity of creative resilience in response to tragedy as a way to maintain Jewish continuity. And that is the point of my talk today, how his story points to the long legacy of Jewish malleability and inventiveness in response to crisis. So Abramovich, of course, would be correct in his prediction about the coming age of migrants and refugees. And in fact, at the time when Abramovich was writing this story, one of the largest migrations in the history of the world was just getting underway. Some 25 million Europeans, largely from Eastern and Southern Europe, took to the road. Now, while the causes of this migration were really quite diverse and could be attributed primarily to long-term transformations in European society, such as industrialization, urbanization, nationalism, the rise of nation states, European colonialism, World War I, and the establishment of the Soviet Union. The historian Tara Zahra, in her work, The Great Departure, Mass Migration and the Making of the Free World, also reminds us of the following: that this mass departure was sudden and unexpected. Contemporaries described emigration as a contagious fever that infected entire villages. She quotes Leopold Caro, a Polish Jewish lawyer and emigration reformer who reported that entire regiments left in 1907 in order to earn money in America. Many houses stood empty, and many others, only old women and small children remained behind. In some villages, the entire young generation left home. Everyone believed that America was the promised land, a true paradise. Now, the great Yiddish scholar and demographer of Eastern European Jewry and one of the founders of YIVO was Jakob Leschinski, who wrote actually in his very first work of scholarship, which was actually written in Hebrew. He wrote a work in 1903 called The Statistics of One Shtetl. And this was another work that I went over line by line with my Hebrew teacher, Arnie Band, way back in the 1990s. He wrote this work, Statistika shel Ayra Achat, so Statistics of One Shtetl, which was a study of his hometown of Horodice, Ukraine, in which he described how the town was just literally emptying out, seemingly overnight, on account of extreme poverty and despair. As people moved away to cities, as they moved away to America. And so what we see is that Zahra's findings are sort of confirmed by Leschinski's own study. I'll also note that this town was just shelled last week by the Russians, and it's come under attack sort of repeatedly since April. As Leschinski talks about in his work, and then much of his scholarship really for the rest of his career, which lasted until 1960, that the consequences of this mass migration were really profound on Eastern European Jews, as some 2.5 million Jews took to the road in this time period. Perhaps the most profound of them is that they frayed the bonds of Jewish continuity that had existed over the previous century when Jews were confined to the Pale of Settlement on that western rim of Russia. This movement, of course, was mainly from east to west, and for most the destination would be the United States. Another, of course, consequence of this is that this migration led to the establishment of American Jewry as ultimately the dominant force in world Jewry for more than half a century. But also, quite fascinatingly, that this migration from east to west also began to create new centers or new sites of Jewish, and in particular, Yiddish cultural creativity. Now, I've taken this map from the temporal map of Yiddish publishing by Yona Lubin, which you can see, which is on the bibliography, and you can see the URL there itself. Is that what we begin to see is that there's a transnational community of Yiddish speakers that begins to develop as new centers or sites of Yiddish cultural creativity begin. So we can see London, Berlin, New York, Paris, Montreal, Buenos Aires, Tel Aviv, Montevideo, Cape Town, Melbourne, if you look in the bottom right of that map, that we have all these new centers. And Yiddish scholars today are just starting to kind of understand these large networks of Yiddish publishing and creativity. And I'm just going to give a plug for my colleague, Nick Underwood, whose book, Yiddish Paris, just came out early this year. And it really describes kind of just how Paris became such a major site in the 1920s and 30s for Yiddish. And of course, the changes that were underway for Eastern European Jewry in the late 19th and early 20th century were not only geographical, but they reached into every aspect of Jewish life. They were religious, economic, gender, familial, cultural, etc. And also there are other manifestations of this transformation as well. that there was a shift from imperial identities to national ones. And really, indeed, this is a time period that's defined by rupture, but also by profound transformation. And indeed, what it meant to be Jewish was very much in flux in this time period. And of course, by virtue of the new biological determinism of the age, it was almost entirely inescapable. And one had to be a Jew. One couldn't escape that Jewish identity as one could have in previous decades. And so what that meant was that Jews were forced to come up with new expressions of Judaism and to be Jewish. And yet in this age in which many would be deeply pessimistic, we also experience a golden age, really, of Jewish creative resilience. Now, this notion of creative resilience is something that in many ways was first sort of identified by the Hebraist Shimon Ravidovich, who in fact was actually one of the authors of the Yiddish Encyclopedia, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But in 1948, he wrote an essay that wouldn't be published in English until a couple decades later, called Israel, meaning the people Israel, so Jews, called The Ever-Dying People. And in this now sort of classic essay, Ravidovich, who was really one of the last Hebraists to be working outside of Palestine or the land of Israel, makes the claim that it's the threat of the Jewish people's destruction that has been the spur for its innovation and creativity, and really the key to our survival as a people. And he traces this phenomenon of Jews are sort of imagining that they're always on the cusp of destruction as something that begins in the biblical age. And he traces it in this really kind of amazing essay, which is really quite brief, through the Jewish Middle Ages, the time of the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, the modern, and to the modern period of Jewish nationalism and the secular movements. And he sees this as perhaps the one true constant in Jewish history that each generation would imagine that was going to be its last. And he writes, "He who studies Jewish history will readily discover that there was hardly a generation in the diaspora that did not consider itself the final link in Israel's chain. Each always saw before it the abyss ready to swallow it up. There was scarcely a generation that while toiling, failing, and rising again, being uprooted and striking new roots, was not filled with the deepest anxiety, lest it be fated to stand at the grave of the nation, to be buried in it. Each generation grieved not only for itself, excuse me, but also for the great past that was going to disappear forever, as well as for the future of unborn generations who would never see the light of day." Now, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the crises of anti-Semitism and other consequences of the modern age led to the establishment of a whole range of Jewish movements and ideologies. And you're familiar with many of these, I'm sure. Certainly students in the Zoomer program are diaspora nationalism, Zionism in all of its many incarnations, Jewish socialism, communism, and secularism, as well as new religious expressions and denominations. And most profound, for me, is the revivals of Jewish culture that emerged at this time period. We, of course, have the flowering of modern Yiddish culture, of modern Hebrew culture, new American Jewish identities. There's new ways that German Jews responded to this time period. There's the insights of Nick Underwood's work about Jews in Paris and so on. Now, the subject of my book is this new project that began in the 1930s, the establishment of this really phenomenal encyclopedic project called the Algemeyne Entsiklopedye. And this is what I'll talk about really for the next 15, 20 minutes or so for the rest of my talk. Because I think nowhere is this phenomenon of creative resilience perhaps more clearly demonstrated than in this Yiddish encyclopedia. And this is a project that began, as we'll see, in 1930 in Berlin, just on the eve of Hitler coming to power, and continues through the crisis of Nazism, has to relocate several times, and is able to be really one of those few threads of continuity that span the middle decades of the 20th century, when nearly every other cultural project that was begun by Eastern European Jews prior to the war really came to an end. YIVO, of course, stands as one of the other great cultural projects that was able to span those horrific middle decades of the 20th century that are almost entirely defined by rupture and really endings. So I'll talk a little bit about the beginnings of this project. So this was a work that began in 1930 in Berlin, Germany, among the last members of a once vibrant community of Yiddish speakers. This included Yiddish scholars, activists, intellectuals, who came to the sort of collective decision that the time was ripe to finally have an encyclopedia in the Yiddish language. Now, there had been Yiddish dictionaries, of course, Yiddish lexicon, Yiddish grammar's work, but there had not been an encyclopedia in the Yiddish language that really presented the knowledge of the world to the 9 to 10 million Yiddish speakers. Among the founders of this project were many of the figures who were central to the establishment of YIVO itself, such as Leschinski, who I've already mentioned, also Avram Rosen, went by the name Ben Adir. Raphael Abramovich is perhaps the most famous of the various figures. He was the leader of the Mensheviks in exile. It included Raphael Abramovic, who was an art historian, an architecture historian. And really at the center of this project was the sort of the towering figure of Simon Dubnow. And for those of you not familiar with Dubnow, Dubnow was the great historian of Eastern European Jewry. He was the first historian to look at the material aspects of Jewish life as opposed to the sort of the spiritual and religious components of Jewish history. He took Eastern European Jewry, Eastern European Jews seriously as a subject of historical research, took the Yiddish language seriously, and in many ways was a mentor to a whole generation of Yiddish scholars and activists. Because what he argued for was that Jews had the right to exist in the lands in which they found themselves. And he organized both on a scholarly level, but also a popular level and a political level to try to create Jewish continuity in Eastern Europe. And he found himself in Berlin in the 1920s, having been displaced, like so many of these figures, from the Soviet Union. So these figures ended up in Berlin as a result of larger geopolitical and economic forces. Berlin was a place where they could make a living. They seemed safe from sort of the trials and tribulations of life in the East. And what these figures wanted to do was to create a Yiddish encyclopedia that would convey all of the knowledge of the world to a Jewish audience who was just on the cusp of coming into their own understanding of themselves as a nation. And what was going to differentiate this encyclopedia from the other Jewish encyclopedias that were out there was that this was not to be a Jewish encyclopedia, but rather a general encyclopedia written in a Jewish language. Now, prior to this time period, we had Jewish encyclopedias that were written in English and in Russian. There were several projects underway in Germany, but all of these were Jewish encyclopedias, meaning they contained knowledge of Jewish history, Jewish religious practices, major Jewish literary works, and so on. And they were conveyed, though, in non-Jewish languages. And so the Algemeyne Entsiklopedye, meaning general encyclopedia, was to really be the inverse of this. So this was to be a general encyclopedia written in a Jewish. And the goal among many was to sort of add their page to the great book of learning of the world. That this would be a sign that Jews really had arrived as a people. But immediately in the planning stages of this project, it aroused enormous sort of controversies in the Jewish world. There were even fights among different figures within YIVO over what should this encyclopedia contain. And many of its first advocates really thought this should actually be a Jewish encyclopedia in the Yiddish language. And there was enormous fights over this. Max Weinreich, who's really sort of the founder and leader of YIVO, insisted that it should be a Jewish encyclopedia. But instead, what was reached was a compromise that about 80% of the information would be general, and about 20% of the information contained in the encyclopedia would be on Jewish topics. And most of that would be relegated to a supplemental volume called Jews, Yidden, that would appear at the very end of the project and would be a bonus to those who subscribe to the entire series. So that was the plan really at the outset. They imagined 10 volumes of general knowledge and really 1 volume as a supplement of Jewish knowledge. So this is a project that begins in 1930 in Berlin at this moment of sort of great optimism for the Jewish people. At the opening ceremony, Dubnov himself calls this the Bible of the New Age. So really, he's bestowing it with, sort of the highest accolades. In 1932 and in 1933, they release a Probeheft of the encyclopedia. So this is a specimen volume. And this short booklet, it's about 50 pages or so, gives us kind of the best indication of what the encyclopedia would have looked like had it actually gone along the route which they had originally intended. The first of these, as I said, was published in 32. It was meant for subscribers. The second has the date, as you can see on the left here, Berlin, 1933. It's released just days before Hitler comes to power. And in this encyclopedia contains a lot of information that you might expect from, an encyclopedia, right? So there's depictions of dinosaurs, right? Obviously inaccurate by what we know now. Of course, brontosaurus were, many times larger than steam engines. There's entries on obelisks. This is one of my favorite slides, Pesach Insel, Easter Island. And so what this encyclopedia contained was sort of basic knowledge and information about the larger world. But immediately, soon upon releasing the second edition of the Probeheft, of course, Hitler comes to power. And the encyclopedists are Jews, they're leftists, and they're foreigners. So they have three strikes against them. So almost immediately, they have to flee. A few of them are arrested, like Leschinski, who spends several days in jail until he's released. Abramovich is tipped off ahead of time. He's able to flee. Dubnov just stays a few months and leaves by the summer of 1933. Now, the encyclopedia is scattered, but most of them made their way, as did most refugees from Germany in this time period, to Paris, where they had to go through a full kind of reconsideration about whether to continue this project. Was there a basis for it anymore? They had lost much of their funding. They had, many of their writers for it and contributors for it had scattered over different parts of Europe, looking for places of refuge and places to resettle. And it took quite a long time, almost 2 full years, before they could reconstitute the project and finally release what became the first volume of the encyclopedia, which goes from Aleph, and as you can see here, from Aleph to Atlantic City. And almost immediately, they recognized that the project itself is going to have to shift a little bit. So rather than put out 10 volumes plus a supplement, they're going to 20 smaller volumes to help keep their costs down. And hopefully by selling each individual volume, they'll get enough money to be able to publish the next one. And in this first volume, it's a fascinating work. It contains full color maps of different parts of the world. It has articles on essays such as like Unterwasserschiff, so submarines, on X-rays, on a whole sort of broad range of topics, just what you'd find in encyclopedia. And indeed, they modeled themselves after the Encyclopedia Britannica or the French Larousse or the German Brockhaus and Ephron. It contains plates in color of famous works. Here we have Lesser Uri's Yirmiyahu, his work Jeremiah. And this encyclopedia continues, but they're not able to maintain the rate that they hoped. And indeed, if the first volume comes out in 1934, the second doesn't come out until 1935. And by 1936, a third volume comes out, and already we can see that the encyclopedists are starting to change what they imagine to be the intent of the work. So at the very end of volume 3, there's a large essay on anti-Semitism, which fits alphabetically with what the encyclopedia, with how the encyclopedia is laid out. But instead of just being a simple entry, it's actually a full-length, multi-authored piece on the history of anti-Semitism. And it includes enormous numbers of illustrations, such as here, a set of riots in Germany from the early 19th century. And it's the first kind of clue that they're beginning to kind of rethink what the encyclopedia is going to do and what kind of information Yiddish readers need at this moment of enormous change and transformation that's underway. Same thing happens again in volume 4 in 1937. At the very end of what's an otherwise sort of standard work, there's a long multi-authored entry that goes on for many, many pages on Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel / Palestine. And indeed, here we have, once again, a long essay dedicated to the history of the land of Israel, the various peoples who have been present in the land, and then a long discussion of Jewish settlement during the Zionist period of the land. And now the majority of the encyclopedists themselves are not Zionists, they are diaspora nationalists. They believe in Jewish life, organized Jewish life in the diaspora. But you can see they're beginning to sort of maybe soften their views in some ways, recognizing that increasing numbers of Jews are trying to flee Europe, and the places that they're able to go are really quite limited in the world. So that's 1937. In 1938, a year of terrible crises in the world, nothing's published. But in 1939, they released the first of what would become what they said is a 2-series set on Jews. So what they decided to do is publish the supplement early ahead of schedule. And they say they're doing so in response to the shifting circumstances. And what they begin to realize is that what the knowledge that Jews need is not necessarily that of the larger world at this particular moment, Yiddish speakers, but what they really need is an encapsulation of their accomplishments in the world so far. It's what we see in these first 2 volumes. One's published, you can see, in Paris, 1939. The second is published in Paris, 1940, after the war starts. And what they recognize is that the information that Jews need in the world at this moment is really self-knowledge, that they see themselves as, once again, thinking about Rabidovich's work, that really on the cusp of an enormous tragedy. And what they want to do is begin to create an archive of their enormous contributions and achievements as a people. So here we find essays on modern Yiddish literature, modern Hebrew literature, essays on demography, Jewish economics, many essays on the Jewish labor movement and school systems, really trying to encapsulate what is sort of really, the best of Eastern European Jewish culture. And if you look at the dates, it's also quite fascinating. So the first of these comes out in the spring of 1939, that is just on the eve of World War II. But of course, the war begins in 1939 and Poland is invaded. And so by the time they release the second of these works in April of 1940, most of their audience is cut off for them. And this volume, Yidden Base, is actually sent to America, but the ship on which it's sent is sunk at sea. And it's widely thought that it's sunk by a U-boat, but it's not something I was able to confirm. But a few volumes survived because they were sent through the regular mail, and these volumes were able to be reprinted. But of course, a month or so after Yidden Base is released, Germany invades Western Europe and invades France, and it forces the encyclopedists once again to flee for their lives. And they're able to make the very harrowing journey from Paris to Marseille, and then from Marseille across the Pyrenees through Spain to Portugal, and finally make their way to Lisbon, which by the fall of 1940 is the last port from which people can escape in order to go further westward. And they're really fortunate. Most of the encyclopedists who are able to make their way out are able to get to the United States. So you can see this telegram from August 30th, 1940, about Abramovich and his friends, like that's the large group of encyclopedists, who are able to make their way to the United States, just as Germany is sort of advancing on them. And in this moment, they then have to reconceive, what is going to be the function of this encyclopedia, and they grab with them the manuscript for a third Yidden volume. They grab with them the plates on which many of the volumes were published, their index cards, but they have to leave behind thousands of volumes that have yet to be sold, their administrative files, their administrative records. Almost all of this has been lost. And so you can imagine it really was a challenge to try to reconstruct much of this work. But in coming to America, what they realize is they have to rethink all of their plans, that what they had intended the encyclopedia to be can no longer be sustained. And when I was in the archives, actually right before I gave an earlier talk to YIVO several years ago, I came across this quote, which still sort of haunts me still. This is from a letter written by Benadir, one of the early encyclopedists, to the theater critic Alexander Mukdoni, in which he was writing about how their plans have become completely undone. And he writes, "A Mensch tracht und Hitler lacht," right? Man plans and Hitler laughs, or substituting God for Hitler in this famous sort of aphorism. And that pointed to me the fact that, as much as they had made their plans, they actually need to constantly shift and remake their plans in order to accommodate the shifting needs of their readers. So in coming to America, they have to rethink the encyclopedia almost entirely. And they have to begin to imagine, first during the war years and then in the post-war years, what is this encyclopedia going to be? What concerns is it going to address? Because immediately these figures realize that in some aspects, they're among the last remnants of this once thriving Jewish people. And so they continue to publish this encyclopedia, having arrived in New York in 1940, for another quarter century. The final volume is published not until the mid-1960s. So, for example, in 1950, they put out what becomes the fourth volume in the series Jews, Yidden, which they talk about the period of migration. But by the early 1950s, what they recognize is that they have before them a set of 4 tasks that need to carry them through, because they recognize that as really the last survivors of this once great culture, that they now have this new obligation that they need to take on this set of tasks in order to maintain Jewish and in particular Yiddish continuity into the post-war period. They realize they have these 4 tasks before them. One is they want to salvage, of course, the remnants of Yiddish culture from Europe. They want to reestablish this now even larger network of transnational Yiddish speakers, which is scattered really in many parts of the world, on account of the flight from Nazi Europe. That they see that they have an obligation to document the khurbn, the Holocaust themselves, from the point of view of the victims and survivors of the tragedy, not only from the point of view of the perpetrators. And then this last imperative becomes in some ways the most powerful for them, which is to make Eastern European Jewish histories of service to American Jewry. They see themselves as once being the heads of a Jewish community that really set the tone and tenor for much of Jewish life and culture around the world. And now they see that they need to create a legacy that they can hand off to American Jewry to make use of in order to really keep the Jewish people moving forward. And so they also produce a 4-volume Yiddish version of their encyclopedia called Jewish People Past and Present, in which they recognize that the number of Yiddish speakers is really declining in the world and that they need a new idiom in which to translate this culture. But this doesn't stop them from publishing further volumes in Yiddish. And ultimately the last 2 volumes are ones that were published in 1964 and 1966. And these are on the Holocaust itself. And these are multi-authored works that contain some really the finest scholarship of the 1950s and 60s on the Holocaust itself. All of them are written by either survivors or by inhabitants of the countries in which they were born or lived. And they talk about the Holocaust and how it impacted Jewish communities all throughout Europe. And so I think there's 26 different entries representing one of each of the countries that fell under Nazi rule, including, a short entry on Luxembourg. So with these final volumes, they've really sought to, convey, the full history, as full history as possible of Eastern European Jewish life. And we can just look at this penultimate slide that I have here, so you can sort of get a sense of what the encyclopedia looks like. And I love this image very much. It was taken by a photographer for the press because it shows us, what the encyclopedia ultimately looked like, and you see it's in so much contrast to how we typically view encyclopedias. When we think about them, we admire encyclopedias for their uniformity and their coherence and their standardization. But when you look at a full set of the Yiddish encyclopedia going from right to left, you see the Probeheft, that specimen volume, the first 4 volumes that are in black, numbers 1 through 4, that were published in Paris. And then you can see the shift that occurs. of the volumes that were the Yidden volumes that are published. There's that one in a box in the slipcase. That's one of the only surviving copies of the Yidden base that was largely lost at sea. And then you can see the post-war volumes that are published in sort of much better quality materials that are also largely unused and unread, and then the final volumes that were published in English. And the only thing that connects them all are those twin sets of gold bars that are at the top of the bottom of all the sets. So as a way to conclude, I hope to have conveyed to you that the Algemeyne Entsiklopedye is much more than just a disjointed collection of obsolete information, but that it contains snapshots of how many of the leading Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century interpreted the Jewish past, present, and future, and what were some of the most tumultuous decades of Jewish history. And taken as a whole, this work is an unrivaled depiction about how Yiddish cultural and intellectual activists tenaciously responded to the hopes, traumas, and triumphs of the middle decades of the 20th century, when they went from achieving some of their greatest accomplishments to suffering some of their most profound losses, and then sought in the best tradition of Abramovich and the great Jewish sages before them to have had the courage to reimagine a new path forward into the Jewish future. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen here, and then we can move on to questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Barry. That was a fascinating talk. Many questions, and I'll just start with a few, but if anyone has any more questions, please put them in the Q&A. We have a few minutes here. So one question I have is, you talked about the relationship with YIVO, that a lot of these people were involved with YIVO. I was just curious, was there any official relationship with the project, and how did that pan out?
Yeah, so this actually begins as a YIVO project, which is something that I think YIVO as an institution sort of forgot itself, because in the YIVO encyclopedia, there's no entry dedicated to this project, and there's only some scant references to the encyclopedia itself. So it actually begins as a YIVO project by the YIVO activists like Elias Cherikover, Leschinski, and others who were based in Berlin. And they started something called the Dubnov Fund in the name of Simon Dubnov. And that was meant as sort of the fundraising arm for this project that would be otherwise administered out of Vilna by YIVO itself. But in 1930, of course, if you know the history of YIVO, this is when YIVO is now in its 5th year, right? It started in 1925. And it's trying to build a new building. And so it has taken on enormous expenses for this new beautiful building that it has created. And it realizes that it simply can't provide the startup funds for this. But there's also ideological differences. You know, YIVO is very much about the perpetuation of Jewish life and Jewish culture among Eastern European Jews. And the idea of putting out an encyclopedia of general knowledge was in many ways, you know, from the point of view of Max Weinreich and others in Vilna, you know, sort of too far removed from what their central goals were. So after a series of sort of fights and arguments in the early 1930s, YIVO sort of divorces itself from the project, but officially gives its endorsement of it and allows the Dubnov Fund to kind of go off on its own. In the end of the project, in the last decades of it, YIVO once again begins to take up some responsibility. And as fundraisers begin to go off into, you know, the far reaches of the Jewish, and in many ways the Yiddish diaspora, you can see that there's organizational coordination between the encyclopedia and YIVO. So as fundraisers go off, you know, to Jewish communities in Winnipeg and Montevideo and to Havana looking to raise money, they're raising money for both projects together. And there's always YIVO activists and employees even who are working on the encyclopedia, but there's always a kind of a formal split after 1930-31.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
In terms of the planning of the project, because an encyclopedia obviously has it's in alphabetical order. So was there a kind of master plan set out? You mentioned index cards. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So there was a master plan, because I've seen references to it, but it's been lost. And the truth is that there was, I think, many different master plans, where they're constantly reimagining what the project is going to look like. At the outset, they had a series of different divisions. They had a philosophy division and a literature division, science and technology, although I don't think those are the words they use for it, economics and so on. Very much along the lines of the divisions of YIVO. And they had different figures who were editors of those sections. But this quickly begins to change, because these figures are not young men when they start the project. They're already in their 40s and 50s. And so many of the key figures pass away in the 1930s before the project even starts, really getting much of its steam. And so they're always sort of reimagining what the project is going to be, almost from the very beginning, because the crises are coming at them so fast. And really the only record that we have of what the encyclopedia would look like is that Probeheft, which is the only volume of the encyclopedia that's actually digitized and available for anyone to look at. It's at the Yiddish book centers in their collection. So if you put Algemeyne Entsiklopedye into their search window, you can see that. And that will give you a sense of what the plan looked like when they first imagined it in 1931. Yeah.
Speaking of seeing the volume, someone had asked in the chat where they can go to look at this work. I mean, I know we have copies of it at YIVO.
Yes.
So if you're in our reading room, but you have any other recommendations?
So going online to the Yiddish Book Center will allow you to see the first Probeheft from 1932. Otherwise, there are individual volumes that are scattered across libraries around the world. So when I first started this project, I began looking at it in 2006, a very long time ago. I was asked to write an essay for a volume that my teacher Gennady Estreich was working on Jewish encyclopedias, and I owned a couple of volumes of this encyclopedia, and I never really kind of understood it. It had different numbering and lettering systems, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll write something on this. And my library, when I was in upstate New York at SUNY Albany at the time, they had a few volumes, and in order to look at a full set, I actually had to go to YIVO, and I remember taking the article was due, and I remember taking an emergency sort of trip down to YIVO and spending several days there looking at a full set. It's very hard to get a hold of an entire set of the encyclopedia, especially if you want to get the originals. It's almost impossible. It took me many years, but the New York Public Library has it. Libraries around the world, though, will have individual volumes. It's one of my goals that if I can sort of draw enough attention to this project, and if this book is successful enough, I can sort of make the case to get the money together and the permissions to digitize the entire project, to have it be available for researchers.
Wonderful. And I know you touched on this throughout the talk, but maybe could you just kind of summarize what is in that final picture there? What ended up being the kind of full, complete output?
Sure. Yeah. So what we have in the end are the Probeheft, the two volumes, and there's actually interesting differences between them, because the Probeheft, when it came out in 1932, was such a sensation in the Yiddish world that it garnered its own critical reviews, and it was just an advertising document. But there are whole reviews that were written about this, attacks on it in the Soviet press and in the Hebrew press, praises in many parts of the Polish Yiddish press. So there's changes between the 32 and the 33. And then we have only 5 volumes of general knowledge that get published. They only make their way partly through the second letter of the Yiddish alphabet, through the letter base, and it ends with Balei Chayim, so wild animals, is the last entry of the work. So in many ways, it doesn't even come close to succeeding in terms of the original task it set out for itself. But they published 7 volumes in what was just to be the supplement. It was originally supposed to be 1 volume. So they have 7 volumes that fall under the category of Yidden. And here we have many volumes that are dedicated to Jewish life and Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. So kind of amazing essays. Some of them, 100 pages or so, by figures like Shmuel Charny, who writes really a full history of the Yiddish language, or long essays by Raphael Abramovich on the Jewish labor movement and various components. You have really fascinating essays on Jewish anthropology and areas of Jewish demography, on Jewish education that end up in those volumes. And then you have, you know, these last volumes on the Holocaust, which are really some of the best scholarship. Some of these were published, and then what becomes this 4-volume set to the Jewish people past and present. So all told, they released 17 volumes, if you include the Probeheft, and then many reprints as well, because the TSICO, the Jewish Culture Congress, takes responsibility over this project in 1940 for many years, and publishes reprints in 1948, in particular, of many of the volumes that had been published up to that time period. So in the end of my book is a long sort of bibliography trying to show all the different manifestations, and there's many, yeah.
You spoke a little bit about this, but could you speak a bit more about the various authors' relationship to the Yiddish language itself and who they imagined as their readership, and perhaps how that changed?
Yeah, so at the outset, most of the contributors to the work were figures who were very, very active in Yiddish cultural movements and Yiddish political movements of the 1920s and 30s. Many of them were figures who came of age during the time of the 1905 revolution in Russia, which was subject of my first book. And so, meaning that they were born around 1880 or so, in the Pale of Settlement. And so they're born in 1880, which is this moment in which this enormous transformation really begins, much of which Abramovich writes about for, in his own works. So by the time of the 1905 revolution, they were in their early 20s, and they were communists, and they were socialists, and they were Jewish nationalists, and they really sort of threw themselves into this revolutionary fervor. When that revolution is suppressed in 1907, many of these figures begin to turn their energies towards Yiddish culture and really begin, writing some of the first grammar works, the first lexicons, some of the first works of Yiddish literary criticism. They really see themselves as tasked with trying to create a Yiddish high culture. And by the time of after the First World War, they see themselves really as kind of the keepers of this work, but they're also intensely political figures. So they're involved in Jewish diaspora nationalist movements. Abramovich is the head of the Mensheviks in Exile, for example, right, which was populated by many former Russian Jews. And so for them, their commitment to the Yiddish language, was just a formative experience for them. And what they imagined of their readers, in the opening address that Dubnov gives for the launching of the encyclopedia, he talks about the 9 to 10 million Yiddish speakers who were around the world. They really saw those Yiddish speakers as being on the cusp of moving into the modern age. They recognized that Jews were, like other Europeans, were mostly members of the working class, that they were sort of bound to the factory whistle, that their days were now regulated by, the new industries. And what they wanted to do was to provide a means by which sort of to uplift them educationally, because they recognized that their readers were not people who are going to be likely the beneficiaries of much schooling, for example, certainly not university training, and probably not most post-secondary training of any sort. And so they wanted this to be a popular encyclopedia meant to sort of uplift kind of day-to-day Yiddish readers. But of course, after World War II, in the khurbn, they recognized that the language of the Jewish future is not going to be Yiddish. That the Jews, Yiddish-speaking Jews, were now located in countries in which the Yiddish language could not really continue at the rate that it had been going, right? So they were either in Israel, they were in America, they were in the Soviet Union, and none of these places was Yiddish going to get the support that it needed in order to continue. And so they begin to realize that they need to create sort of a legacy that they can leave behind, so that Yiddish and the Yiddish culture and their contributions would not be forgotten and could be of use to future generations as they charted, a path forward.
Wonderful. have a lot of more questions that we won't unfortunately have time
Oh,
for.
we're at time. Yeah.
Perhaps we can end with one final question.
Yeah, please.
Speaking to that point, how would you evaluate the impact of this project overall?
Yeah, so I struggle with this question a lot, right? Because, those last volumes of the encyclopedia were never read and they were never sold. In 2008, I remember going over to the Tziko and visiting High Wolf when it was located just above Union Square in the Atron building. He took me down to the basement, and I write this in the conclusion of the book, is floor to ceiling are copies of unsold or unsold volumes, especially from 1964 and 66, those last two volumes of the khurbn. So the legacy is somewhat hard to assess, just at the moment when the encyclopedia sort of concludes is when Yiddish itself is going through a very profound transformation, right? We have in the same year, it's 1968, that we have Uriel Weinreich's dictionary comes out, which is really this amazing encapsulation of the Yiddish language. But it's also the same year that Leo Rosten's Joys of Yiddish is published. And I don't even know if I have a copy on my shelf, but it sort of represents these two strands, right, of Yiddish, that there's still this group of Yiddishists that want to maintain the seriousness of Yiddish culture. But you also begin to see the popularization of the Yiddish language, where it takes on a symbolic meaning that's much sort of more impactful in some ways and influential than sort of its actual usage. And it's hard for the encyclopedia to find a place in either of these two strands. That, the number of Yiddish readers has declined so much that they don't really need the Yiddish encyclopedia. And for a more popular audience, there's no place for the Yiddish encyclopedia as well to inform and shape that movement. It's my hope through the scholarship to return the Yiddish encyclopedia back into conversations about Yiddish, because it is such this treasure and really kind of a quasi sort of lost book to history that I think is worth spending our time and attention on as we continue to think about where Yiddish is going to go on into the future.
Well, Barry, thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating talk.
It's really my honor. Thank you.
And we'll recommend to everyone your book. We'll drop a link to that in the chat, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much. It's really my honor to be here.